Hi guys, is the audio fine? Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay, good. Yeah, I'm not really moving any of the pieces right now. So can you not see the board over? Okay, so is it all okay now? I've just linked the URL for the video. Yeah, so I hope everyone can see the board and the video now. Okay, so I think we should start, right? Yeah. Okay. So today we're going to be looking at some instructive Rui Lopez games. And Rui Lopez, I think, as you all know, is one of the oldest and the most popular openings in chess history. So this opening was basically analyzed a few hundred years ago in Spain, and since then it has been played like millions of times in all levels, from the world champions to club level players. Today we are going to be looking at two games in the Rui Lopez. So the first one is between Fischer and Keres. So Fischer, I think, as you all know, is considered to be one of the greatest players of all time, former world champion. Yeah, yeah. So he was also very popular. He was a popular exponent of the Rui Lopez opening, uh, and that was basically his main opening against one e4 e5. So he basically found out a lot of ideas in the Rui Lopez and used it extensively. Rui Lopez is also the kind of opening which suited him very well, since he was a universal kind of player. He could play both tactically and he was also very good at positional chess. So that is the kind of opening the Rulo Lopez is. It lets you play as you want and will definitely improve your game if you pick it up. Okay, so let's just start. Yeah. So we'll go over the first few moves. I think all of you know what exactly the Rui Lopez is. Yeah. So this is the starting position of the Rui Lopez. Bishop to b5 against knight to c6. And here black has a lot of options. The most popular one is this. Yeah. So this is basically the topical position. Even nowadays, I mean, this is one of the most popular Rui Lopez positions. So here h3 serves basically two purposes. One is it just prevents the bishop from coming to g4, and the other one it is not exactly showing what white wants to do. So white is just keeping his options open. He could later decide to go for d4, or he can even play d3. And also, in certain cases, the king has some room on the h2 square. Yeah. So this is basically h3 is one of the most popular opening positions in Rui Lopez. So here black has a lot of choices. There are basically two main choices for black here. So the first one is knight to b8, which is called the Breyer variation, and the other one is knight to a5, which is called the Chigorin variation. So nowadays the most popular one is knight to b8. The idea being he wants to come to d7 and put the bishop on b7, add some extra pressure on the center. The knight can later come to c5. So yeah, so I don't understand which knight you're talking about. So I'm just going to link the URL once again for those who just joined. Really a good waiting move, and black has two main options. One is knight to b8. Okay, so you mean the knight on c6 after playing bishop b5? Yeah, that is also possible. So that's a different opening setup altogether. It's quite different from this one. Yeah. So here, as I was saying, black has two main options: knight b8 and knight d7. In this game, he decided to go for this one, knight to b8. Obviously, you don't want to exchange this bishop for this knight because that would not be desirable for white. This bishop is quite strong and he wants to keep it. And also, if you exchange this bishop for this knight, black's bishop might become quite strong. So instead, he retreats the bishop to c2. And now black just plays c5. This is, I mean, a pretty normal move, just controlling the center. And now when he goes back, the pawn is no longer blocked by the knight. So white just continues d4. Again, a very normal move. Yeah. So here in this game, Keris decides to go for the move for queen to c7. But there are also quite a few options for black here. One move which is quite popular nowadays is knight f to d7. So the idea behind this is he wants to push put the bishop on f6, and then the knight comes to c6, and there's some pressure on the d4 square. But in this particular game, Keres decides to go for the main line, which is queen to c7. This used to be the most popular continuation, and even now is one of the most popular continuations. Yeah. So here Fisher just plays quite normally. This is pretty much the main line in theory. Even at the time when this was just being developed, this was very popular. Yeah. So Keres decides to take this pawn. C takes d4, and now bishop d7. Also, he later started playing this move, rook d8 in a few cases. The idea being this, and black breaks through in the center, and this gets quite complicated. So against rook d8, later players like Karpov start playing this move, pawn to d5. But in this particular game, Keres just decides to play normally with the move c takes d4, and bishop to b7. So he's just developing his pieces quite normally. The bishop is on a good square. So yeah, there's some pressure on the center pawn on e4, and next he's just going to put his rook on c8, or maybe even d8. So White has a very interesting maneuver in these lines. So he basically wants to get his knight to a good square on either f5 or d5. So to do that, he needs to first have the knight on either e3 or g3. So, for example, the way to do that would be to come via f1, right? So that's what he does here. Knight f1, rook c8, and bishop d3. So basically, the bishop on c2 is now being threatened by the rook and the queen. So he has to defend the bishop. To do that, he plays bishop to d3. Now the knight on a5 was completely useless, which was not doing much. So black just brings his knight to c6, putting some extra pressure on the d4 square, and also he might be aiming to come to the b4 square. So the question is, what do you think white should play now? Okay, so all of you are saying yeah, pawn to d5. Okay, pawn to d5 is possible, but there is a problem with pawn to d5. So, what do you think is the problem with pawn to d5? Yeah, so pawn to d5 would basically attack the knight on c6, and also it will just block this bishop on b7, right? The knight is attacked, the bishop on b7 is blocked, and white is gaining some space in the center. But the problem with pawn to d5 here right now is that black has this knight to b4. So as I already said, ideally you don't really want to exchange this bishop for this knight, and if you just retreat with the bishop, he has this pawn knight to c2. So it just forks your rooks. So then you're forced to capture this. And for example, something like this, something like this would not be ideal for white, right? The rook comes to the seventh rank, and black has two bishops. He can double on the c file, and he even has possibilities of removing this and playing pawn to f5. So d5 right now would not be a great idea for white. So instead, Fischer decides not to go for the move pawn to d5, and he plays this move knight to e3. So this looks like he's just blundering a pawn, right? I mean, black can recapture the pawn with either the his own pawn on e5 or his knight on c6. But in fact, this is actually not a blunder of a pawn, and it's quite a good idea by white. So let's see what happens if he plays knight to d4. First of all, the most natural move. So obviously white has to take, and now knight to f5. And now, who do you think is better here, white or black? Yeah, exactly. So white is doing quite well here because all his pieces are going to be developed quite quickly. So for example, if black plays something like rook e8, it just says bishop g5, putting a lot of pressure on these squares. So now also the queen can come to f3, the rook can come to c1. This pawn can be recaptured whenever he wants, and he even has ideas of f4 and maybe pawn to e5 at some point. So white has a very dangerous initiative here. Black doesn't want that, and also in this particular position, there was one more move for black, which was knight to b4, force the bishop to b5, b1, and then yeah, then capture this pawn here. So what is the problem with this? It looks like black has won a pawn, right? But why is it not working for black? Okay, bishop e4, knight takes e4. Okay, so bishop e4. I just take back with the knight. Now what? Yeah, exactly. So now just a3. So attacking the knight on b4, the knight has to retreat. It can't come to c2 because the knight on e3 defends the square. So it has to go back. And now this knight to d5, attacking the queen. And wherever the queen moves, it doesn't matter. White just wins the piece. Yeah. So this is not a great idea for white. For black, I mean, he can't really win the pawn on e4. So here instead he decides to play the move. Also, ed4 is also the same thing. White just comes to f5, and then the bishop comes to g5. He can capture the pawn if he wants in the future with knight into d4. He'll have an open file for his rook. So this is quite a dangerous position for black already. So instead, he decides to go for this move, knight to rook to e8. Yeah. So here, white has a lot of choices. So what do you think white should do here? There are a lot of options, but some are better than the others. Try to come up with some idea for white. Yeah, so knight f5 was a move played by Fischer. It is a decent move for white, but there's also something a lot more interesting. Yeah, knight f5 is a good move for white. Anything else? Any other option? Knight d5. Knight d5, I think might allow this. It takes knight to b4. Yeah, this is also quite possible, I think, using bishop f5 here. Yeah, this might be possible. But then the d5 pawn is going to fall. White will probably win the e5 pawn, but black will win the d5 pawn. And a lot of pieces are getting exchanged, so you don't really want that, right? Yeah, so the move which Fischer chose in the game was knight to f5. So the idea is, I mean, extremely simple. Just getting the knight to an aggressive square on f5, putting some pressure on the bishop on e7, preparing to bring this bishop to g5. But one more try which he had in this position was the move pawn to d5. So this basically attacks the knight and forcing the knight to come to b4. Obviously, you don't want to exchange this bishop for this knight, so you retreat to b1. And now something like this, for example, yeah. So something like this, I mean, would be quite a good idea for white, right? So basically, the pawn on b4 does a very good job preventing the knights from coming to c5, and the pawn on b5 is quite weak. The bishop can later come to d3 to attack the pawn on b5. The bishop on b7 is not doing much. It's blocked by the pawns on e4 and d5. And once the bishop comes to d3, white can consider something like rook c1. And this position is quite pleasant for white. He has a huge bind on the position. But Fisher decided to reject this, and instead he went for the more aggressive and direct approach with knight f5. Yeah, so both these approaches are possible, but this is, I think, an even better try for white than knight f5. Yeah. Okay, so let's see. So obviously, black doesn't want to exchange this bishop for this knight because, I mean, this bishop does a good job of defending the king side. So he retreats the bishop. And now black develops with tempo, bishop to g5. The reason this comes with the tempo is like black doesn't want to allow the move bishop captures f6, and his king side pawn structure is completely ruined. So obviously he's going to go back with the knight. Yeah. So he just goes back to d7, and all of white's moves achieve something here. So for example, the move rook to c1 just gets the rook to an open file, and the rook is basically opposite to the queen. Now white has a direct threat of pawn to d5, which would just win the knight on c6. So black has to react against this. Goes back to b8, and I mean white has various ways to continue here. Fisher decides not to commit anything right now and just wait for his opponent to show what he's doing. Yeah, he just plays bishop to b1. Now, Karius has had enough and decides to release the tension in the center. So instead of just waiting for white to do something, he decides to be active and plays the move knight in d4. So obviously, white recaptures. And now black makes a big mistake with rook captures c1. So at this point, he had to play the move e captures d4, and after queen captures d4, he had to maybe play this position, maybe something like even this. And white is obviously better here, but black is not doing that badly. But rook captures c1, he just missed a move by black here, missed a move by white. Yeah, so this is white to play. White has a very strong move here. Okay, we have queen g4 and knight h6. Yeah, queen g4 is also possible here, but I think black might have this move, knight to go back, and then there could be some possible defense with maybe knight to g6 in the future. Still, this looks good for black for white, but Fischer played a much stronger move here. White has something much more direct. Yeah, yeah. So the correct idea is knight to h6 here. So obviously black cannot go to h8 because the pawn on f7 is hanging. So he has to capture the knight here. And now comes queen to g4. No, sorry guys. Yeah. So now comes queen to g4 check. So the point of this is quite simple. He has to go back to h8, and now white just captures queen takes d7, and obviously white is a pawn down in this position, but that doesn't matter at all because just look at black's pawn structure. Pawn on f7 is weak. Double pawns on h7 and h6. The queen is misplaced on b8. Yeah, and the pawn on d6 is also weak. White has a lot of attacking potential with the two bishops on b1 and c1. So this is quite a bad position for black already. It's quite difficult for black to play here. But Karius at least finds something interesting to complicate the position. He plays this move bishop to d5, so which defends the pawn on f7. Since this is not possible due to this, yeah. So now Fischer has a lot of options here, but he gets tempted and goes for the move queen to f5, which looks good, but he had better options here. So what do you think White should have done? Yeah, yeah. White has a lot of options. So basically, the queen is not attacked right now, so you don't have to move to f5. And the idea you guys are going with is correct. You want to do something about this bishop. The bishop would be better placed on d2. Also, the point I think is now we are just threatening. Now we are threatening to capture the bishop on d5 since the rook on e1 is defended. Yeah, so this makes sense. Here, I think black should try something like this: bishop e6 and queen a8. Yeah, so this is of course possible, but an even better try, I think, for white in this particular position is just bishop to d4. Same idea, but the bishop is more active on f4. But the only difference is right now you're still not threatening to capture the bishop on d5 because the rook is hanging. But for example, if black tries to exchange the queens like this, you just completely avoid the queen exchange. And just in this kind of position, d4 is very weak, h6 is weak, b4 is weak, the f6 square is weak, the d6 pawn is weak. So black has a lot of problems. But Fischer misses that strong idea and goes for this move queen to f5. But here, this allows some counterplay for black. He starts with the move rook to e5, attacking the queen, and now black has to go back. He goes back to f3, and now a very strong move by black, pawn to f5. So obviously the pawn cannot be captured because the rook on e1 is hanging. So Fischer decides to go for this move, bishop to f4, attacking the rook. And now Keres plays the move rook to e8, but in fact, a stronger move for him would have been rook to e8, with the idea of an eventual queen e8 in the future. So this makes more sense, I think, for black. He's just doubling on the e file and putting more pressure on the e4 pawn. Okay, but in the game, he decides to go for the move rook to e8, and yeah, Fischer just gets his queen to a good square. Now, obviously, he can't capture anything on e5, d5, or f5, so he decides to activate his queen to h5. Yeah. So now black captures the pawn on e4, and now white has a lot of options. White has a lot of options again. I mean, something like this, I think, would not exactly be ideal. He can even take rook captures e4, for example, and a lot of pieces are getting exchanged. It becomes very difficult to exploit the king side weakness. So instead, Fischer decides to go for this move, pawn to f3. Now, obviously, this is impossible because of this. The rook on e8 is hanging. So black just defends the rook on e8 with the move bishop to e6. Again, now white has a lot of choices. So what do you think white should do here? Yeah, exactly. So taking the rook would not be a good idea for black here, for white here, I mean. So you're just exchanging in black's favor. So for example, this, and now if you capture the pawn here, just bishop g6, and white is even losing here. So you don't exactly want to exchange the rooks. You want to keep the rooks on the board. So there are two ideas for white here. One is rook d1, and the other is rook c1. Rook d1 is possible, putting some pressure on the d4 pawn. But I think rook c1 is even better. This is the move that Fischer chose, gaining a tempo by attacking the bishop on c6. And also, obviously, you're going to win one of these pawns the next move, f5 or h6. Now, black plays the move bishop to d7, and again, white has a lot of choices. He can either capture on h6 or he can capture on f5. In this particular game, Fischer decides to go for the h6 pawn, but also this was completely reasonable for black, for white. I mean, yeah. So in this position, the pawn on d4 is weak, the pawn on d6 is weak, pawn on h6 is weak, the pawn on a6 is weak. So white is doing quite well here. Black has a lot of weaknesses, and the piece activity is a lot low compared to white. So, for example, something like this, and white has moves like this. So, white is doing quite well here, but Fischer decides to go for this move instead, bishop to h6. He probably wanted to get rid of the dark squared bishop for black and try and have some kingside initiative. This is also fine. Yeah, so now this rook e6. He wants to take the bishop on f8 with the queen and activate it instead of allowing white to activate his own queen with this. Yeah, so I mean now the d4 pawn is hanging. Black just defends it, and white goes for this endgame. And we'll just go over the endgame quickly because yeah, it's not that relevant to our particular study right now. So as you can see, Fisher is just targeting black's weaknesses. So the goals of the endgame are go for the opponent's weak pawns and push your own pawns. So right now he doesn't really have any good pawn pushes. White. So he decided to go for the decided to go for opponent's weak pawns. So in this position, for example, white is already a pawn up, and black has weak pawns on d4 and b5. But white is still not losing this. Black is still not losing. He has a lot of resources. Yeah. So here Fisher. Let's just see how Fisher converts this endgame. So now black, instead of defending passively, is trying for some activity with the move rook to c8, c7. He is occupying the open file. So yeah. Now white goes for the white goes for the other weak pawn, which is the pawn on f4. So black does what he wanted to do anyway. The rook comes to c1, attacking the bishop on b1. So he obviously defends the bishop. And they repeat a couple times. But yeah, I mean Fisher doesn't want to draw, of course, so he decides to defend the pawn on g2. Now giving up the pawn on g2 for the pawn on f4 would not have been a great idea because black can also win the pawn on b2 and then the pawn on a2 is weak. So he decides to defend this pawn and takes the pawn on b5. Just going for the weak pawns on d4 and e4, f4. Now under time pressure, black makes a huge mistake. There was no need to go for this move pawn to h6. Instead, he could have just captured the pawn on b2. But he went for this move h6, pawn to h6, and yeah. So even this pawn is going to fall. So white will be two pawns up. So Fisher decides to play it safe, bring the bishop to a very good square on g4. Both these pawns are protected solidly, and then he just goes after the f4 pawn. Finally, decides to exchange the rooks, and you only have to be careful of one trick here. Yeah. So obviously, you need to push these pawns. Yeah, and what would happen if pawn to f5? Is pawn to f5 a good move here? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, even though you're two pawns up, you would manage to draw the game here with a move like pawn to f5 because I'm sure, as you all know, this would just allow bishop to f5, and no matter what you capture with king or bishop, this in game is impossible to win because of the wrong colored pawn. So you need to have a dark squared bishop to win this endgame. But unfortunately, white has a light squared bishop. So no matter what he does, this endgame won't be won. Black will just keep on shuffling in these squares late, and this endgame is not going to win. So obviously, Fisher knows this and doesn't go for f5. He has to find a different winning plan, and he manages to do that. So obviously, he just trying to exchange the bishop for the bishop. and that will be a very easy win. Two pawns ups, nothing to think about. Black doesn't allow that so easily. Finally, the time is right to push the pawn. Yeah, and I mean now there's just no hope. One of these pawns is going to queen, and black just decides to resign here. Yeah. So as we also a very nice display by White, especially in the opening, he found some good ideas and showed us exactly how the Rey Lopez has to be played. Some typical themes in the opening, and also he showed us what kind of endgame to go for when exactly it is favorable for White. Yeah. So let's move on to the second game now. Anatoly Karpov and one of the best players in the world at the time, Svetozar Gligorich. So this is also a Rui Lopez game, and I'm sure as you all know, Karpov was one of the experts. Yeah, this is the last game. Yeah, so I think as you all know, Karpov was one of the best position players ever, and also an expert on the Rui Lopez. Uh, I don't know if you heard this or not, but he was also a very strong exponent of the prophylaxis idea. Prophylaxis is basically just preventing your opponent's own ideas. So we'll see that applied quite nicely in this game. Yeah. Okay, so Capo is yeah. So we reach the Rui Lopez position. Yeah. And here in the last game we saw black decide to go for this move, knight to a5, which is the Chigorian variation, and white decided to retreat the bishop and play pawn to d4. But in this game, black decides to go for the other main variation, which is knight to b8. So the idea, as we already saw, was knight wants to come to d7, and then maybe pawn to c5, or in some cases even knight to c5 is possible. So this is the opening that black decides to go for, and the main line here is pawn to d4, and then just the typical play: knight comes to d2, knight comes to f1, knight comes to g3. But in this game, Karpov decides to avoid that and play the move pawn to d3. So there are a few reasons behind this. Yeah, so there are a few reasons behind this. One is that his opponent was a very big expert of the Breyer variation, so this is called the Breyer variation. He was a very big Rui Lopez expert, and also he just wanted to play this game positionally. Karpov and didn't want to go for anything too sharp or tactical, so he decides to go for the move pawn to d3. Okay, guys, I think you need to concentrate now. Yeah, so he decides to go for the move pawn to d3, and black just follows up with his normal ideas. So this is all pretty common up to this point. Yeah. So this is the typical position in the Rui Lopez opening, right? The knights are on g3. The knights are on g3 and f3. Pawns in the center. The knight is maybe aiming to go to f5. The bishop can later be developed to either d2, maybe e3, or even g5. There are a lot of possibilities. The idea is like knight h2, knight g4. I mean, then queen to f3. So there are various ideas for white here. So again, this is a very typical maneuver for black in these positions. He just wants to play pawn to g6 and bishop to g7, solidify his king side, and this is quite a solid position for black. Here, Karpov decides to go for the move pawn to b4, which is a more direct approach. He also had one more idea of course, going for the move knight to h2, and then just follow this up with moves like d4 or queen to f3, knight to g4, maybe even pawn to f4. So he had this idea as well. But in this game, he decides to go for the move b4. So black retreats. So even though the move b4 removes the knight, kicks the knight out from a good position on c5, it also allows some counterplay for black on the queen side by moves like c5 and a5. So this is a double-edged move. Both sides have the pluses and minuses. Yeah, and here finally Karpov. I mean, he has a lot of options. He can maybe go something like he can play something like a4, and also still moves like knight h2 are possible. Moves like bishop e3 are possible. Moves like bishop b3 are also possible with the idea of knight to g5. But Karpov in this game decides to go for the move pawn to d4, just taking control of the center more. Yeah, and black again has a lot of options. He can go for moves like knight to b6, pawn to c5, I mean pawn to g6, bishop to g7. So yeah, this is a position with various ideas for both sides. Black just plays pawn to h6, preventing all sorts of knight g5 ideas for black. Also just a waiting move, not exactly showing what he wants to do, and letting white come up with something. So white doesn't do anything drastic yet. Just develop the bishop to d2. So if you'll notice, the way Fischer plays this position and the way Karpov played this position are quite different. Fischer had a much more direct approach, a much more aggressive approach. So he went for the knight to f5 ideas and things like that. So his approach was a lot more direct compared to Karpov, and he eventually managed to get moves like knight h6 in. But Kapo's approach is more solid, more like restrained, and he is not doing anything too aggressive or ambitious. Just developing all the pieces to the right squares and waiting for his opponent to show his hand, and then he's just going to react accordingly. So knight b6 again a solid move by black. So the c4 square, which was weakened by moves like b4 and d4, he just wants to jump into the c4 square. A very natural idea by black. Yeah. So just bishop to d3. I mean, as you already know, Karpov was a big expert of prophylaxis, just reacting to the opponent's ideas, preventing the opponent's ideas. He sees that the knight wants to come to c4, so he's already like ready to just capture the knight if it comes to c4, preventing that idea. And also the bishop is better placed on d3 than it was on c2. Now there might be some ideas of a4, for example, in the future. Yeah. So black just plays rook to c8. Now black's main idea in this position is he wants to get in pawn to c5, put some pressure on the b4 pawn and the d4 pawn, and maybe an eventual d5 in the future. Just simplify the position. He plays rook to c8, and again just queen to c2, developing the queen finally, getting the queen out of d1. The queen adds some extra defense to the square on e4, and also the queen on c2 is obviously better placed than it was on d1. Yeah, so here I mean black has a lot of options. So the main and the most natural option for him, of course, is the move pawn to c5, or rather even better, first take the pawn, and now that the rook is directly opposite to the queen, he has this move pawn to c5. But here, I mean, Karpov just wanted to go for this, and this is again a double-edged position. So I mean, black has this strong pawn chain on the queen side, but white has a lot of space in the center, a solid structure on e4 and d5, some ideas of coming to f5 with the knight, putting the bishop here. So again, this is a very double-edged position, but I mean, if you play rook c8, you have to go for this, right? Otherwise, rook c8 is kind of pointless. Play could have continued something like c4, attacking the bishop. Bishop goes back and b4. Again, this is again a very interesting position. Both sides have their own play. Black is playing on the king side, on the queen side, sorry, and white might want to play on the queen side, get this bishop to a good square, if they like this, or maybe even the knight could come to d4. One knight could go to f5. Their ideas like rook e3. Yeah, so both sides have a lot of play here, but black doesn't go for that. It instead comes up with this maneuver, queen to d7, which doesn't make that much sense. He wants to put the queen on c6, but doesn't realize that it's not going to achieve too much. Again, white just plays perfectly normally. Develop the last piece. The rook on a1 is obviously not doing anything, so got it to d1. defending the d4 pawn some more. And the rook is just generally better placed on d1 into c6, and just bishop to e3. Now all of white's pieces are doing quite well, right? The bishops are perfectly placed on e3 and d3. Knights are very well placed on g3, f3. The queen on c2 is, I mean, okay, it's maybe not the best square yet, but at least it adds some extra defense to e4. And the rooks are well placed on e1 and d1. So yeah, the c3 is one weakness in white's position. So black tries and exploits it with knight to a4. Just rook to c1, defending the pawn on c3. He comes back, seeing that now the knight on a4 is pointless because c3 is well defended. Again, this prophylaxis, wants to keep this in line with the queen. The queen goes back, realizing that didn't achieve much. Yeah, knight to d2. Instead, he could even have gone for knight to d2 here, Karpov, with the idea knight to b3 and knight to a5. But he misses that opportunity and goes for this move. Now black can prevent it with pawn to c5. Now knight to b3 obviously doesn't work because of the move pawn to c4. So I think white captures. Now black would like to play c4, but the bishop, knight on b6 is handy, so he goes for this. And now what should white play here? Important move.